If you're trying to conceive and feeling overwhelmed with fertility advice, then this podcast is for you. Welcome to Don't Tell Me to Relax, your fertility podcast and antidote to unhelpful fertility information. I'm Hannah, a fertility acupuncturist, teacher and campaigner for better fertility education. This podcast aims to empower and inform you about your menstrual cycle and fertility. It's basically all that information you didn't get in sex ed at school, with the aim of improving your understanding of your reproductive health and optimizing your fertility. Hello and welcome back, everybody, you lovely people, to Don't Tell Me to Relax. Today I'm joined by Angela Heap, who is a fertility nutritionist. And Angela, is it 15 years you've been supporting people?
It's actually 16 this year now,
16.
so it's quite a long time. I think it's me and Mel that have been kind of in the business the longest in terms of calling ourselves fertility nutritionists. I think the lone wolves there right at the beginning, kind of moving through that. So
you are fertility support royalty then.
Oh yeah, I hope I'm not Queen Camilla. Let's be the Queen.
Well, you've been supporting people with their fertility through nutrition for many years then, and you also are a lecturer at the British College of Nutritional Health and the British Association of Nutritional Therapists. Is that right? Do you still do that?
So I do lots of different lecturing, and I think that's kind of how you move into different areas really as a nutritionist. And, you know, I come from a long line of teachers, sort of 3 generations of teachers in the family, so it makes sense really to kind of follow the family tradition. And
Yes.
I started lecturing probably about 5 or 6 years ago. I really enjoy it. It's really great to kind of interact. I know you guys do lots of lecturing yourself. It's just a really good way to give back, really, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. I've only recently started doing it, and I really, really enjoy it. I get so much satisfaction out of working with people in that way. And I'm a teacher. I was a teacher originally, so
Oh, were you?
like,
Amazing.
I feel like I've gone full circle.
I also lecture at the College of Naturopathic Medicine as well, so that's where I studied
Right.
in 2005. And actually, they're asking me to write the advanced degree lecture now for fertility, so I'm kind of gone full circle myself. So yeah, it's great to be involved in writing that side of it and also lecturing as well.
Yeah. And today we're going to talk all about like toxins, plastics, microplastic, all that kind of world, because it is an important part of fertility support and actually general health anyway. And I think that I personally find it quite overwhelming, and I like to bury my head in the sand about it, to be honest, because I find it a little bit too much. And I know lots of people who are trying to conceive, they often come into clinic and ask questions about plastics and toxins and chemicals and all of this kind of world. And so I just thought it would be really good to have you on to talk about it and kind of help us feel less overwhelmed about the whole situation. So can you tell us a little bit about what it's all about? It's a very general question. But
It's a huge topic, and you're
it
absolutely
is,
right. So many people get really, really overwhelmed by it because, you know, there's so much crap in the media. Do this one time for 2 years and then don't do it, and it just confuses the hell out of me, including myself. You're constantly researching to try and find out and disclose what's new and what's happening. But obviously, as soon as we changed from kind of, the 1950s through to the 60s, chemicals became a huge part of the way we lived our lives to make life easier. And I think that's generally the main reason behind it, really. I know in the 80s, my mum had sort of Tupperware parties, and plastic was seen as the big thing, wasn't it, to make your life easier. And there's all those memes out there, isn't it, with, people putting tomatoes in Tupperware and it completely staining it, and, all sorts of things about how you use, chemicals in your life. And generally, it's something, if you've grown up in the 80s and the 70s, that you are quite familiar with. And if you're a little bit older, if you were a baby boomer, you remember times where things were cooked in cast iron pans. We didn't have non-stick anything at all, and life was a little bit more difficult. But I think, as soon as chemicals are on board and the big petrochemical companies were involved in, trying to make a little bit more money after the war when changing chemicals into using them for human use rather than industrial use. That's where the problems
Yeah.
started to arise. And then obviously things like pharmaceuticals as well, and some of the runoffs in the rivers and things like that, or the chemicals used as part of those processes. So it is overwhelming. We live in a world now where we can't avoid chemicals at all. But what we want to do is try and sort of mitigate for some of those things that are causing problems. And I think for the first time last year, they actually found microplastics in cord blood of the first human. So it's actually getting into the ecosystem so much so that it's actually in the blood before you're even born.
Oh my God.
So it's quite doom and gloom when you start looking at this. And I think when I start talking about this to my clients, you can see their face drop, and you can see them sort of look like, well, what can I do? And if this has been causing a problem, how do I know how much of a problem it is? But
Yeah.
we can do some major things. There are chemicals around us all the time, but there are things we can do to pull it back to maybe how it was in our grandparents or a great grandparents' era, looking at some of the things we use there and trying to avoid those kind of major chemicals in everything that we do. And, that's how I kind of pitch it really to them, because
Yeah.
as nutritional therapists and people who specialize in functional medicine, we are the Debbie Downers of the world. We're not sort of going in there saying, we'll give you this lovely massage or we'll treat you to something, just lie back and relax. We're kind of, like I said this earlier to you, didn't I?
Yeah.
We kind of put a mirror up to people and say, it's within your sphere of influence. You can do this, but you have to make a difference. You have to make a change in your life to look at this and say, there is a reason why there's fertility issues happening in the world now. And a big part of that is the fact that chemicals are a big part of our lives. So, yeah, we can make a difference. We can really help to pull that back. But half of the problem is we don't know how much it's influencing us and how much of a difference it is, really.
And what do you think are the knock-on effects of these sort of chemicals, microplastics, toxins? Like, how does it impact our health? And then how does it impact fertility?
So, it basically is absorbed into our body, and the
Mm.
body doesn't know what to do with it. So they call it endocrine disruptors. And if you think about the endocrine system, it's all the systems in the body that work, that support your hormones, really. And, it's thinking about the brain, the ovaries, the testes, the thyroid, the parathyroid. All these kind of systems communicate with each other all the time. And if there are microplastics, plastics, chemicals, it's literally going, not sure what to do with that. We'll put that there for now. We'll deal with that later. And then it becomes this bioaccumulation in the body. And I'm not saying that everybody who has fertility issues, they are riddled with chemicals and plastics and all sorts, but it has probably made some sort of a difference in the body.
Mm.
And, as nutritional therapists, we can test for some of these things. We can test for chemicals. We do lots of things through companies like Genova Diagnostics that look into the amount of, super high chemicals that are coming from things like pesticides and herbicides, and even, runoff from chemicals and industrial use and things like that. We can also test for things like bisphenol A, which is the plastic that's added to things like the inside of cans and bottles and all sorts of things to make it easier for manufacturers to sell their food so that it doesn't leach and rust. But actually, the after effects are that it can build up in the body and cause, major hormonal issues, really.
And so you can actually test to see the level of which you have some of these chemicals in your body.
Yes, you absolutely can. I mean,
Oh.
it's kind of fairly early days. It's probably only going with those testings in the last maybe 7 to 10 years.
Yeah.
And it gets better all the time. If I think that there are some major problems, if I go through a health questionnaire and ask people where they've lived in their lives and where they've kind of, introduced all sorts of things happening to their lives in childhood all the way up to where they're living now, it can be, a really interesting thing to look at. People who've
Yeah.
lived in Southeast Asia or Africa and places like that, where maybe some of the laws around chemicals are a little bit more lax than they are in the EU,
Yeah.
and even in the US as well. Some of the laws around chemical uses, because chemical companies and agricultural chemical companies are the big donors to these political parties, so they don't necessarily curtail them in terms of the use of some of these chemicals, because there's a lot of profit in it.
Yeah. And I in that book, I can't remember who wrote it, but the book about it's called Countdown, that's about the decline in sperm rates.
Mm.
Um, I
Shauna
think
Swan.
that's it. Yeah, she
Mm.
refers a lot, doesn't she, to this idea of environmental toxins being
Yeah.
a big part in this decline in male fertility. And I guess in many ways, male fertility is much more easy to study and observe and test, because female fertility is much more complicated, isn't it? Because you can look at a man's sperm and you can see whether they would be able to conceive or not on a
Mm.
sperm looking at the DNA. But with a female, it's much more complicated. So I guess we can assume that if it's having an impact on sperm quality, that
Yeah.
it's definitely going to be having an impact on egg quality as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, we are much more delicate, I think, than men in terms of the what we absorb, because we have more fat on our bodies, we're more lipophilic. So again, it gets put in the fat of, all of the body, really, in females. With men, generally, as you said, it's really easy to test, but there's not really anything at the moment that can test for the levels of chemicals in sperm, really, to see
Yeah,
if that is causing a problem. But it's safe to say that, if there are some problems with that, it's not going to do any harm, is it? Taking away maybe a lot of the chemicals that maybe people will be using on a day to day basis. I mean, you only need to look at your shampoos and conditioners, just for men, and they're only using a small part of that. I think women literally use something from 50 to 250 chemicals before they've even left the house
oh
sometimes,
my god.
on some of their makeups, their hair products, their face
Yeah.
creams. They use a lot more than men. So again, we probably do have a lot more chemicals in our body probably than men do.
Yes, and I was just gonna say, so what are the main in a day-to-day life, just thinking about when we get up in the morning to when we go to sleep, where, is it every single point? I mean, this is really depressing, but is it literally every single point of our activities that we come into contact with these chemicals?
I mean, yeah, it's, if we're taking a drink, we're drinking water, aren't we? That
Yeah,
may have some chemicals that hasn't been filtered out. We're cooking our foods in that, we're having showers. Chlorine can have a really big impact on, absorption into the skin. Shampoos, conditioners, face creams. If you think about the times that you've used any product on your body, drunk water, cooked foods, and even worn clothes. You've got things like the forever chemicals on rain macs and stuff like that. You are literally a complete walking sort of chemical, really,
yeah,
as you're walking out of the house, compared to what our grandparents had. Nothing like that in the realms of the way that chemicals were used back then. Maybe in the 50s they started, sort of playing around with chemical use and sort of managing that. But I think because we knew about some of these chemicals from the 80s onwards, we started to put laws in place for those. But there are situations where, we don't know generally what the bioaccumulation of all of these things together are actually causing. Some of those things can be related to, more detrimental diseases like cancers, and, the spread of rapid inflammation in the body as well.
yeah, yeah, and I was just thinking then when you were talking about this massive increase, especially in women, of autoimmune conditions,
Mm.
and how that just seems to be everywhere. And I wonder whether in years to come there will be research that says that one of the reasons is this chemical input into the body.
Yeah, absolutely. And if we think about it from a very early age, we've got probably 10 times the amount of vaccines with babies than we had when we were little. So they're having chemicals introduced, even if they're, having as many chemicals as us, we're having
Yeah,
extra, from a
yeah,
very, very early age. And, you can sometimes do analysis as well on the amount of, chemicals in the body by doing a hair mineral tissue analysis. I know this is quite poo-pooed from conventional medicine side of things, but that's a really interesting way to do a very basic test to look at whether you've got any detrimental heavy metals like thallium and all sorts of things like mercury if you're eating, things that are polluted from the sea as well, if you're eating a lot of tuna fish or,
Yeah.
big fish really that can absorb some of these runoffs from factories. I mean, I've just recently moved from London to Brighton, and we went on a bit of a trip with the family all the way from sort of Worthing to Brighton. And I didn't realise, but there's so many chemical companies along that kind of seafront route. And I thought they'd stopped doing that along the sea.
Right.
But you can
Yeah.
understand now when they're testing the water, them saying, it's not suitable for human swimming because there are lots of chemical companies that discharge into the sea as well. So,
Yeah.
people laugh at me when I'm sort of there looking at the sewage and, influence of what's happening and where I go to before I go into the sea. They're
Yeah.
like, little bit anal there, Angela. And actually, it's because I know, and
Yeah.
it's not a nice thing to start to realise that actually there's a lot of chemicals out there in the sea and in the environment. But what you can do is really sort of be more aware of that. And I think when you work with a practitioner who tells you this, you get that kind of face of, oh God, this is really, really, the the area's just gone much deeper now in terms of
Yeah.
what I thought I could control. And
Yeah.
you can manage it, but there's a point that you get to where you can get really paranoid about it. And I think you move through that and say, look, everybody's in the same situation, but here's a couple of things that I can do that will really help to manage that situation.
So what are your kind of where do you yeah, exactly. Where do you start with this? Like, what are your kind of big kind of things that you recommend that people can do?
So you cut it into three areas. So it's liquids, it's foods, and it's things you put on your body or you use, And
Yeah.
then what you can do also then is look at some of the implements that you contain your food with and you cook your foods with. So again, talked about the forever chemicals on, Teflon type pans and things like that. So going back to cast iron pans and cooking with those, when it comes to storage of food, making sure you're storing it in something that doesn't leach chemicals into it. I mean, I don't necessarily use the microwave because I've not been a big fan of that for years. So I'm not kind of, using the microwave in a plastic container, which will then heat it and bring it back into the food, really. So I use things in a conventional way. I heat food up or I make it from scratch. And I make sure that there's little amount of chemicals on that food by going as much organic as I can. I'm not obviously a saint when it comes to that. Everybody has to eat, don't they? And I would
Yeah.
not worry people too much about that situation. But being as, chemical free on your food as you possibly can be is another way to reduce that down a little. And then there's things like filtrating water, having a shower filter maybe on the shower and using something that filters the water properly. So there's full filtration systems in the house you can use, or there's some basic sort of, filtration systems that you filter most of your water with. You can get something that I've seen recently and been chatting to a company, which is an underwater sink filter, which is,
Mm.
a pretty good one, which then means you don't have to worry too much about having these ugly metal canisters up on your countertop and, looking like a bit of a freak really when everyone comes round that you've got all these things and gadgets and, you know, looking a bit crazy really with all these things in your house.
What about just thinking about that because I'm just remembering I many years ago I used to have like a Brita filter
Yeah.
and then I stopped it because I was like replacing the filter thing and it was plastic and I
Mm.
just thought and it was a plastic jug and I was just thinking is this I feel like I'm not sure whether this is doing me more good or bad and it was costing lots of money. Are there any like
Well, yeah,
cheap
that's where I
good
say something like
versions?
a, at source water filtration system is good, or using something like a Berkey water filter, which is an American company, and they use carbon to filter and triple filter things through, and that will filter fluoride, which is another subject we could talk about another time in terms of whether it's needed,
Yeah.
because there are some links to Hashimoto's in fluoridization of water in different areas of the country. So the right kind of filter like the earth does with different minerals, filters out certain chemicals and things that aren't necessarily good for you. So carbon filters are great for that,
Yeah,
and charcoal filters, and using something like this that isn't going to cost the earth, and isn't a problem, particularly if you've got things like hard water in your area as well. Um, yeah, I mean, that's what I use. Personally, I use a distiller, which actually takes everything out, and then I
yeah,
put the minerals back into it. But again, you are using up some energy. If you're really green, if you're using a
yeah,
distiller, it heats things, and the steam is what obviously purifies it. So that is going to, cost a little bit, and it's going to be, less energy efficient than, for
yeah.
example, an underwater or a gravity filter kind of water filter there. Um,
And the Brita filters, are they not a good thing?
Not so
Right.
great, no. I mean, it's a start. It's kind of making you think about that a little bit, but it's I think the filtration system used there is a little bit rudimental. So
Yeah,
it's not going to be as good at filtering out really strong chemicals there. And I don't think they even sort of say that in the literature that we will filter out 99% of these kind of chemicals. It's not
yeah,
necessarily part of that. And I think it's good. It's a good start, but it's not going to be useful for filtering out hormones, fluoride, chlorine, all the big things really that are much larger particles that actually, are much more difficult from a
yeah.
normal kind of filtration system to get
Is
rid of.
is there any I'm sorry, I keep going on about jugs. I'm just thinking about myself here, but are there any, like, jugs on the market that's easy? That because 'cause I'm thinking I need something easy that I can just fill
Yeah.
up a jug, stick it in my fridge. Is there anything out there that does that, or
Well,
is it
I think some people rave about the zero filter, but again, I
okay,
think there's a problem with, things like mold building up there. I mean, there's something always with anything, but what
yeah,
I would probably recommend is something like a a Berkey filter, which is a
yeah,
big sort of metal one, and it takes a while for it to filter through, but then what you do is just, open the release tap and you can put a jug into your fridge if you want a
okay,
bit of cold water there.
yeah.
So, I mean, it costs a couple of £100 to do that, and you
Oh,
need the counter
blimey.
space for it. But if you've got a really good one there, then it's actually filtering out quite a lot of those harsh
Yeah.
chemicals.
Yeah, and I always hear because we see it on Instagram all the time about, drinking, water out of a plastic. Like buying water
Mm.
from plastic. What am I trying to say? Plastic water bottles are not
Yeah,
good. So, like,
yeah.
buying
Again, it's the
water.
heating, isn't it? Because they may have been sat in the sun at some point, which then heats the temperature
Yeah,
of the bottle, and then obviously that again goes into the water. And it goes back to what we were saying about the microplastics found in the cord blood. They're so
yeah,
tiny that you don't even see them. It's not like you can look through the bottle and go, oh, I can see some floating plastic in there. It's absolutely microscopic. So, a lot of people, I know, I'm grew up in Hong Kong, so a lot of people used to just use tap bottled water all the time. And even when they come to the UK, even though the tap water is available and isn't, as bad as some other countries, they still continue to use these big bottles of plastic
yeah,
water to drink with. And again, that is going to have something in it that affects the estrogen level of your body. And if you've got a high amount of estrogen there and you can't, detox it for whatever reason because it is quite high, and your liver's overburdened, then, that has been linked back to some endocrine disorders like endometriosis
mm,
and, you know, lots of different kind of, fibroids growing quite abundantly and things that are related more to estrogen and how that, works in the body and how it's detoxed really.
mm,
And we've all
mhm,
got a different flavour when it comes to that. So everybody's different. They may
yeah,
not be able to detox this high level of estrogen, which is it's a fake estrogen effectively. It docks onto the receptor sites in the body and the body's waiting for the estrogen to come, but actually it doesn't. And then natural
yeah,
estrogen can't actually find its way to support the body in the things that it needs to do. So
mm.
it mimics estrogen. It's a huge mimicker of that, but it isn't actually estrogen that's delivered to the body in terms of how it can utilize it.
And so what other, apart from water, what are the other, and like plastics, like, microwave and things like that, what other things can we do, or would you recommend to your clients to do that are not overwhelming?
So I think it's just looking. I have a document that I send out of all of the products that are more natural, because if you pick up anything in the supermarket, if you can't pronounce it, my view is always, what the hell is that, and what is that doing
Yeah.
to your body? So I think you need to be looking at the products you're using on your body, your face, your hair, all sorts of things really. And you wouldn't believe the stuff that even goes into wax. Even if you're getting your legs waxed, there's all sorts of chemicals even in that, like there weren't 50 years ago. So I think it's just having a list of things that you can maybe start removing slowly from your life and reintroducing new things which don't have as many chemicals in there, which are
Mm.
better for you, because the more chemicals that accumulate in your body, the less able your endocrine system is to, dispose of it really. And it just puts it in the fat. It can cause all sorts of problems then long term. And generally, it's my view often that fertility is just the canary in the coal mine. So there's lots of things going on. I think it's one of the first signs that something isn't right in the body, that the body is kind of shouting at you, saying, we need to really pull this back. We need to work on it and understand it a little bit more. And then once things do start to be improved, things start to, flow more readily, really. Sperm improves and cycles improve and all sorts of things, really. And
Mm.
it's just, it seems overwhelming, but I think once it's a bit like the Matrix. You're taking the red pill on the world in terms of chemicals, and you feel like, well, actually, I'm really glad I know about this, because I was completely aware of how my body worked before and how these chemicals have an impact on you. And now I know I can't necessarily take them all away, but I'm not going to add to the load. And I'm going to continue my life being a little bit mindful of the chemicals that are available and what I can do with that.
Yeah, and you know what? That's a good way of looking at it, isn't it? Because I have had lots of people who have literally thrown everything away and started all over again,
Yeah.
which is obviously not an option for people if you not got enough money to do that. But I guess it's when, for
Mm.
example, your face cream comes to an end and you want to buy a
Yeah.
new one, that you maybe make a decision about looking, as you say, about the ingredients, and buying one that's better,
Mm.
less full of stuff, or more natural than the one that you previously used. And the same with like pans and things, because
Yeah.
trying to replace all your pans is so expensive, isn't
Oh,
it?
God,
And
yeah,
then
it is.
and then that becomes another like overwhelming, stressful thing where you're
Yeah.
thinking, oh my God, is this pan causing me problems? But I don't want to spend 60 quid on it. Like
Yeah.
it's it's quite a lot, isn't it?
It is. And I think always do it in sort of small increments of time.
Yeah,
You don't want to, I mean, I'm talking to the majority of women here really in the podcast,
yeah,
but women ruminate on things, don't they? And they're just lying in bed going, God, that pan's made me infertile. That's the reason. And I've had lots of clients that have said, you really rocked my world talking about this. And I didn't really want to say at the time, but it really stressed me out. And I said, well,
yeah,
that's why I give you the information. I don't overwhelm you with too much, and just say, I was in your shoes, 10, 15 years ago when I started studying this area. So I've got a bit of a jump on that. And every year, something new comes up that I add to my documents in terms of things that we need to be mindful of. It's
yeah,
unfortunate that we left the EU, because the EU was a lot better in terms of chemicals and knowing chemicals that were particularly bad. And I
yeah,
think, the US now and other places that aren't part of that, there aren't necessarily as many checks and balances on the amount of chemicals that are used daily and all the time now. So I think it's up to us as consumers to actually look at the back of a shampoo or a conditioner, and maybe do a bit of research on that chemical. There's a great company I use, which is American, called Think Dirty. It's
yeah.
an app, and actually you can put your product in there, and it will tell you if it's a carcinogenic, if it's causing fertility or any other problems like that,
Mm,
or any problems at all, in fact. And it gives it a grading from 0 to 9 or 10. And if it's quite high up on that scale, then you know that that's something to get rid of. If it's quite
yeah.
low, then you don't
Yeah.
necessarily need to. You can carry
Mm.
on using that. So,
What's
that's
what's
an
the name of
empowerment tool.
yeah, what's the name of it again?
It's called Think Dirty.
Think Dirty. I will link it at the bottom of the show notes because I imagine lots of people will be interested in that.
Yeah, absolutely. And
Are
it
there a
is
few
more American, but
Yeah,
you can add stuff. You can take photos of the chemicals on the back and the front, and then
yeah,
over time it will add that to its list of products.
yeah. I think there's something out there's another I've seen it on in I mean, I've seen it on Instagram, I've seen everything on Instagram. Then mi then I'm sure I've seen another thing that does something similar where you can scan the barcode and it will come up
Yeah,
and tell
there's loads of things now. I think
Yeah,
Dirty was the original one, so
yeah,
that's probably got the largest library of chemical companies that are producing that, shampoos and all sorts. So I think, useful to do, but there's a couple of them out there definitely at the moment.
yeah,
There's definitely a gap in the market for the UK because lots of products that are UK and even Australian and New Zealand type products aren't necessarily on the Think Dirty app.
yeah,
So yeah, just see if they are. If they're not, you just have to do a little bit of research behind
mm,
that in terms of some of the chemicals, and you can kind of piece it together with Think Dirty if you look up the chemicals and just go, well, I can make that choice myself because there's a product that has 3 or 4 of the things that are in there. So therefore, I'm not going to be using that once it's run out.
yeah. And, do you have any, like, go-to, brands that you recommend for, like, I don't know, like I mean, I'm a big fan, and I don't know whether I've been, like, hoodwinked into this of, like, Ecova,
Yeah.
and I read somewhere and I was like, "Oh my god, the Ecova weren't really properly, like, good,"
Mm. There's a
and I
lot of greenwashing, Hannah, as you know,
yeah,
because capitalism in its very guise really will be all about what's a trend and
yeah,
what are people going to jump on and buy. So Ecover was one of the first ones, but obviously they're not as green as some other companies.
yeah,
And I think you just got to be aware of that, putting in products to test that and see where it comes on that scale really. So
yeah,
it's better than obviously having something like fairy liquid, because
yeah,
also as part of that there's a lot of people that are vegans as well, and it's tested on animals, and it's part of
yeah,
Unilever, which are the big bad chemical companies.
yeah,
So
yeah,
it's all about its imprint and its footprint on the planet, as well as it
yeah,
being a chemical. It's probably tested on animals if it is from a larger company, or all the raw ingredients were. So even places like the Body Shop, their
mm,
main kind of approach is about animal welfare. It's not about chemicals used, even though it's as natural. And it was
mm,
in the 90s something that was quite, I used to go there as a, strict veggie in the 90s and go, oh, yes, well, I'm, using something that's going to be more natural. But again, you've got some things on the back of there that aren't as good for the planet as they should be. So it's a little bit disappointing when you do think, well, this is going to have, because of the approach that it's had, it's going to have this view that it's going to be good for the environment as well as animals. But
yeah,
I think sometimes that isn't the case,
mm,
with things like makeup and other products. It's sometimes either one or the other.
mm,
Although to be honest, the makeup that I quite like is Inica,
right,
and that's an Australian company. Um, I was quite fortunate really because I used to work at Planet Organic in London, so I used to get an idea of what was the rigorous kind of processes that companies went through to make sure that they had that sustainability side of it and the animal kind of welfare side. So I do know quite a lot of the products
mm,
from that side of things, from the beauty and body care side of things, and I still use some of the face creams that I used years ago when they used to come and train the staff there and talk to them about the credentials and how they put things together. The actual founders of the company. I was really lucky to speak to the founder of a really great face cream called Antipodes, and she is a New Zealand-based company, so she was all about New Zealand products and things that were native to that country. And I think talking to her about the footprint was really good because there were obviously some preservatives in there, but they were as minimal as possible.
yeah.
So I
Are there
think,
are there any, like, good websites that you recommend, that have, like I can't remember, there was one that I used to use that had, like, like, a good option of, well sourced, kind of less chemical products? Do you have any?
Well, you can do Think Dirty. I think that has got quite
Yeah,
a lot of the things on there now. But I'd say in most cases, places like Planet Organic in the
yeah,
UK are going to be pretty good because they go through quite a stringent process of making sure that the sustainability and the animal welfare side of things is quite strict. So, going along to some trainings with some of the things and the people involved in that just proved, that they do exactly what they say on the tin, really. It's
yeah.
mostly checking things thoroughly before they go on the shelves.
Yeah. Okay, well, I will try and list some websites and some pointers that we've talked about, because I know what I find is that, like, my family moan at me because they're like, Ecover doesn't work. They're like, it's expensive and
Yeah.
it doesn't work. Like, my
Mm.
clothes are still dirty. So, or I've tried a million and one deodorants and none of them work as well
Yeah.
as and it gets really expensive. It's
It
like
does.
it's like a license to print money, isn't it? And I just
Yeah.
think it's really hard to buy well sourced products that are not full of chemicals, that aren't
Yeah.
expensive and work. It's like it feels quite a difficult task.
It does. You go through them, and I definitely have because I'm quite a sweaty person. So
Yeah.
the armpit test is always a good one for me. And I found a really good one recently. It's a new company that tested it on dancers in West End shows. So it
Right.
was quite good. It's called AKT, and I use all of their products, and they're quite useful for that. The only trouble is they come in a tube, so you actually have to spread it on your armpit yourself. So a lot of people
Oh,
don't necessarily like that idea.
why?
Um,
Why can't they put it in a roller? Why have they done?
well, I don't know. Maybe because the consistency is quite
Yeah,
putty-like, it
yeah,
would melt, and they probably tried all sorts of things. But
I'm sure.
I
Yeah,
quite like the ritual of getting this little nub and rubbing it under my armpit. I don't know.
yeah.
Maybe I'm weird.
No, well, I'm up for it. I'm up for giving it a try.
Yeah. And I think, I've gone through quite a few. I think Wild as well, which is a UK company, they're
Yeah,
quite good.
yeah,
There's loads more natural deodorants now. They use baking soda and I think diatomaceous earth as well, which actually helps draw impurities, and it just kind of, stops. It doesn't stop you like an antiperspirant. It doesn't go in there and freeze your armpit. But
yeah.
what it does is it stops the sweat being, particularly odorous, really, shall we say.
Yeah. Well, you know what? You've inspired me. I'm going to do a little bit of research, and I'm going to link some good sites at the bottom of this show to be helpful for people, because I know it's completely overwhelming, isn't it, when you start looking and you don't know where to start. So I'll try and do a little bit of work there. But Angela, I just want to say thank you so much for your time, because I could literally carry on for hours because it's really interesting, but also quite overwhelming, like you said at the beginning.
It is, but just doing, my tips are always just do it in, sort of small increments of time, and don't literally go in there and, to your family and say, I'm chucking everything away, because obviously pans go in landfills as well. So
Yeah. Yeah.
it's, important for that, and just replace things as they get used up. And
Yeah.
then your body will start to notice some changes there, really. And it's lots of different things. It's cleaning products, it's all sorts of stuff in the house. So it's anything that you use in your house you can have an influence over.
Yeah, and that's the thing, isn't it? To think about, like, through your day, what have you used? I'm going to think about that myself. That
Mm.
and what's the level of toxicity in it, and is there anything you can do about it when you replace it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah,
And it's just thinking back to what your grandparents had and how
yeah,
they produced food and how they used things,
yeah,
So it was a lot less chemicals back then. And if we can use things now with our modern technology, which is using those natural ways of producing it and getting better at, things. We're not using things like, cold creams and tallow and stuff to wipe on our faces to help with skin. We're using more natural things with the modern approach, but we're not then having the chemicals with it, because we know we've got all these apps and things now that can tell us where things come
mm,
from and whether the source of those are actually not so good for you.
yeah. Brilliant. Well, thank you very much. I will put all your details on our show notes as well. And thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
No worries. It's always great to chat to you, Hannah, and really enjoyed it. I hope I just haven't scared people to death, really, in terms of what chemicals are out there and what influence you've got over them.
Hopefully not. All right. See you again, everybody. Thank you for listening. If you've enjoyed listening to this and want to find out more, then come and join my free community in Facebook. We have loads of resources. You can catch up on all our previous webinars and be the first to know about forthcoming events. To sign up, just follow the link in the show notes. And if you'd like to work one-to-one with myself or one of the team, then please see our website, hannahpern.com, where you can book in directly or organise a discovery call to find out how we can support your fertility and your reproductive health.